Okay, how I told you in my mails, we are working in the World War II. Okay,
Yes.
and in this moment we have different questions for you. The one
Yes.
questions, could you please tell us some brief about your book and your first idea?
Well, the book was, it was an idea that came from a conversation I had with a man who was adopted as a child during the Second World War, and he wanted his story told. And I said, well, I can't write an individual story, but I would be very interested to have a look at the whole subject of evacuation. And I was particularly interested to see what happened when the children came back after the war, because it was very traumatic for many children to go away, but it was even more difficult for those who were away for a long period to come home. So that was really what I was interested to look at, and the impact of separation on children's lives and on then family life after the war really interested me, and so that was
Mm.
what I focused on.
Okay. As we can read in your page, in your web page, the message of your book is an upbeat or one that celebrates the positive aspects of the evacuation story. Why did you
Yes.
omit the negative aspects?
Oh no, I didn't. There's I well, there's two answers to this question. There is a very disturbing chapter in the book called Reading by a Dark Lamp, and I worked with a social worker on this chapter because I wanted to get it right, because I was looking at the subject of child abuse, both physical and sexual, and also mental child abuse. And so there's that one chapter where I focused on that aspect of evacuation. But what I wanted to get away from was the belief in Britain, and I probably in the rest of Europe as well, that evacuation was a really bad thing for children, because it wasn't. And if you look at the statistics, the same number of children, percentage of children were abused. In fact, it fell slightly during the Second World War as are abused today. It's about 6%. It's a ghastly figure, of course. But I wanted to get away from the belief that rural Britain was a countryside full of paedophiles. And that is the impression you get if you read the newspapers, if you watch the television programs. And so many of the kids who are now in their 70s who I spoke to said to me, oh, you won't be interested in my story because I had a really good evacuation experience. And even those children who went away and were homesick initially and were very much missing their parents, once they settled down and if they stayed in the countryside with foster families, they formed deep, long lasting, and sometimes life changing friendships with the families. And that was what I wanted to look at, because that to me is very important, as well as acknowledging that for the kids who were abused, it was a horrendous experience. So, as I said, I just channeled all that into one chapter, and the other side of the book, the rest of the book, looks at the positive side, whilst acknowledging that many children were unhappy. Nevertheless, looks at the positive side of evacuation.
Hi, Yuli. I'm Rubén. We have read
Hello.
that your father was an evacuee. Was his experience happy?
Yes, he had a very good evacuee experience, and the reason was that he was 10 at the outbreak of the Second World War, and he went away with his school, and his school that had been in Liverpool was evacuated en masse up to the Lake District, which, as if you've been to Britain, you will know is one of the prettiest parts of the countryside. And he was billeted in a post office in a village called Glenridding with his best friend, and he had a really fantastic time. And in fact, he was only evacuated for 2 years, and then he went to a senior school, which was based in Shrewsbury, so that was in the countryside. And then he joined the army in 1945 and spent 2 years in the occupation in Vienna. So he had a very interesting war.
4 years.
He was in Vienna for 2 years, yes, 45 to 47.
Okay. After you have talked to the base, what is your opinion about the government organization at that moment?
I think the biggest single problem about the evacuation program was the fact that nobody took into account the impact that separating children from their parents would have on the psychological nobody took into account the psychological aspects of evacuation, and there was no profiling of the families who took the children in, so it was potluck as to whether children got on well in the families they were sent to. And I think that was so my opinion was that the government failed to address that issue, but that's with the benefit of hindsight, because of course we now know how important psychological profiling is when matching families and children. But I think the sheer scale of the evacuation would have made that very difficult. And also, it wasn't fashionable in the 1930s and 40s to consider children's emotional well-being in the same way as it is today.
Then, do you think that Operation Pied Piper was necessary, and why?
Now there is, I think it was necessary because of the fear at the time that an aerial bombardment of Britain's major cities would result in many, many people dying. I think now we can sit back and say probably they should have done it differently, but at the time the government believed that it was necessary, and therefore I respect that. And also, don't forget, we had seen on our heard on our radios, seen in our newspapers, the dreadful destruction of Guernica, and that had a very big impact both on the British psyche and also on the government, and it persuaded them that it was vital to get children and women out of the city and into the countryside to safety. But also there's a second thing. The government didn't know how the working classes, let's be honest, would behave if there was a bombardment. They thought that the working classes would panic, and they misjudged them in that. But that was what they were most frightened of, so they had to get rid of these huge numbers of people so that only really people who needed to be in the cities remained for the war.
Approximately 3 million people was saved in this operation, no?
Yes, I think it's about 3.5 million people were moved, some privately, and about 1.5 million were moved by the government. And that's children, mothers and babies and toddlers, the sick, the elderly, and the disabled. 60,000 disabled children were moved out of London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Manchester. And nobody ever speaks about those children, and it makes me very frustrated. They were moved with their schools and actually had, by and large, quite a good experience. And then the other 2 million were private evacuees, like my father, either moved with their schools or moved to families to stay there. So yes, it was a colossal movement of people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in your research, you have found curious sentences that people say when they choose the children. For example, I take this, or no, I want that. I want that one. Do you think there is a relationship between the way people choose the children and the way slaves were chosen in antiquity?
Do you know, when I read that question that you'd written, my first reaction was to laugh, and then I thought, no, actually, it's a really good question, because I think you're right. I think they chose the children for personal reasons. So in farming communities, farmers' wives would try and choose the big, strong boys because they would be useful on the farm. In village communities where perhaps farming wasn't the main focus, women would very often choose the little girls if they were pretty. So I do think you're right. I think people chose the children for personal reasons. And I think that was very difficult for the kids because, you know, can you imagine sitting in a village hall and you get passed over because maybe you've got a little brother sitting next to you who's crying, or maybe your face doesn't fit. And I think that must have been hugely distressing. And I think it's the psychological moment that most of the evacuees spoke about, was that awful moment when they sat there waiting to be picked.
Then a lot of children were chosen only for his work or their work for working.
Yeah, so the farmers who were, for example, arable farmers or potato farmers, they were very keen to have the boys to help them on the farm. And there are quite a lot of stories of children who went to farmers and didn't go to school because they were working on the farm, and it wasn't always slave labor. Some of the boys really enjoyed working on the farm rather than going to school, so they were playing truant, if you like. But on balance, I think it was unfortunate that the selection of the children was left entirely to the foster parents to pick and choose as they wished.
How would you describe the moment when the children came home?
Well, again, I think this is a very interesting point, because children came home in all sorts of different ways. So some children only stayed for a few weeks in the countryside. About half the children were home by Christmas 1939 because the bombing that had been threatened had not happened. Some children were perhaps 11 or 12 when they were evacuated. So after 2 years, they'd reached school leaving age, and then they would go home naturally because they didn't need to be in the countryside any longer. So all sorts of different experiences. But I think the fundamental thing was that children generally found it quite shocking when they got home because they had had a completely different existence in the countryside. Now, sometimes that shock would last for a few hours, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for a few months. And for some children, to be honest, it lasted a lifetime, especially if they'd gone from a very poor home to a middle-class home where they had had more education, more opportunities, better food, cleaner housing and so forth. Many children who'd had that kind of change found it very difficult to go back to living in their homes in London. And the parents found it difficult to take the children home because they found their attitudes had changed, their accents had changed, and it was a real culture shock.
Okay, different social places, more or less difficulties. No,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, depend the social place. Okay, the father, the parents send the children different places.
Yes, I mean the private evacuation, that was much easier for the parents to decide, who the children should go to. But the government scheme was run so that the children were sent either by train or bus, or in some cases by boat, to a village, and the majority of the people who took children into their homes were from the lower end of the social and financial spectrum. The upper class homes and the very wealthy didn't want to have evacuee children, and that was a difficulty. But so it was the poorer people who were generally happy to have the evacuee children billeted on them. And it isn't always the case that the children from London or the cities were much poorer than their foster home parents. But it did happen sometimes. Sometimes it was the other way around. Sometimes they were from middle class homes in the cities and they ended up living in very poor family homes. I've got a story of a boy whose father was a tax collector in London, and he went to live with a man who was a railway crossing operator, and they lived in a tiny little house with 2 bedrooms upstairs, 2 downstairs rooms, no heating, no electricity, a lavatory in the garden, and he found that a real shock. But he soon adjusted and enjoyed himself.
Mm-hmm. And what happened with the children whose parents had died when they returned home?
There was a very small number of children whose parents had died, and I think it was done on a individual basis. So one little boy whose mother had died went home, and his father decided that he couldn't cope with the child, so he was sent to live with his aunt. Another girl who I spoke to, her mother died in an accident when her cinema was hit in Brighton, and she never went back to live with her father. She went to live with her grandfather and grandmother. So I think it was individual children had different solutions. It wasn't a huge number of children. It wasn't a significant number of children who lost their parents in the bombing, but some parents died of natural causes.
Didn't a government program exist or something like that?
No, there was no government program to deal with orphaned children. I don't know of any child who lost both their parents. It must have happened, but I haven't spoken to anybody. I didn't find any record of that, although I'm sure it did happen. But no, the government took no responsibility for the children.
Uh, could you have please tell us some anecdote about one of the evacuates you interviewed?
I was puzzling as to which of the stories would be of most interest, and I think the one I want to tell you is about a Jewish woman called Sheila Shear, who is still very much alive, and she and her mother and sister were all evacuated together to a little village north of London, and they went to live with a Christian bachelor. And what was so heartwarming when I interviewed this woman was the affection that she still felt for this man who had simply been for her Uncle Harry. And she spoke very movingly about the time when they first turned up and how Uncle Harry made his home available to them. And I she just spoke with such warmth and with such heart and so much humor. And I got this very strong impression that for her, the relationship with Uncle Harry had enormously enriched their family life. And I found that just fantastic and very inspiring. On the other hand, I did speak to a man called Dennis Southall, who's who had been sent by his mother and father to live on a farm with his younger sister Pat. And the farmer's wife was an absolute brute. She was foul to the children. She didn't feed them properly. They all had to sleep in bedrooms. If any of them wet the bed, they got beaten in public, and the children had no shoes. And it was just ghastly. And Dennis was very honest about it. He very much wanted to tell me all the stories, and I sat in his front room, and he just poured out all this anger. And then he said, "I want you to meet my sister Pat." And Pat came. She lived next door, and she came round, and she just refused to talk to me. I mean, she said hello, of course, she was very polite, but she said, "I cannot talk about that time. I still have nightmares about the time when I was living in the house, even though Dennis, helped me, he looked out for me. But this little girl was only 4 when she went to this house, and all her memories are of being cold and lonely and miserable, and she just couldn't address it." And when I talked to her husband, he said to me, I'm Pat's second husband, because her first husband left her because she was completely unable to show her feelings. And that was as a direct result. And I found that very moving. And she said she'd never been able to show her children any affection because she as a child had never received any affection. So that was quite shocking. That was one of the bad stories in the chapter about abuse. And I felt so sad that this little girl had been unable to deal with it, whereas Dennis, who was 9 when he was evacuated, he dealt with it by speaking and talking and being very open about his experiences. So it was quite shocking to have that juxtaposition of the brother and sister.
Yeah, we know only two horrible stories. The story about Jerry McNeil and the story about one girl locked in bird cage along 4 years.
with only bread and water.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is, I don't think it happened very often, but when it did happen, when it was bad, it was atrocious, and there was no way that the children could get any help. I mean, unless they were brave enough to tell their teachers, and sometimes teachers did intervene and help the kids, because of course children were evacuated to villages with their school groups. And if the teacher spotted that a child was in distress, she might, if she was a good teacher or he was a good teacher, might go round and ask the foster family what the problem was. And there are some children who were moved to different billets because of that. But certainly if a child was evacuated privately, there was no way that the child could complain and could not get their position changed, and that was very distressing. But I do emphasize that it's a relatively small number of the total who had these bad experiences. Most of them would say that they were homesick when they first went away, but if they settled down, then they lived very happily with their foster families.
And the last one, Julie. How would you explain to a 10-year-old child the evacuation and when they return home?
Well, do you mean how would I explain to a 10-year-old child now what happened, or what would happen?
What would happen? Yeah.
What would happen? Okay, so if I had a 10-year-old son and I was going to send him off to be evacuated, just to go back to the war, some parents told their children they were going to be going on holiday and that they would see them soon. Some parents didn't tell the children anything, and the children just were sent off to school that day and got on a bus and off they went to be evacuated. And I think it's very difficult to. I think it would be easier to tell a 10-year-old child than a 5-year-old child, because a little 5-year-old child has absolutely no concept of time or space or distance. And I think it would be very, very difficult. So I think, on balance, parents didn't tell the children. Also, the parents didn't know where the children were going. And this is probably the thing I find the most distressing, is that the parents would wave the child goodbye at the school gate, and they didn't know where the child was going to end up living. And I think that must be the most difficult thing for a parent to handle. And it would have been very, very tough for the parents. And that's the other thing I was very keen to write in the book. I wanted to address the question of the parents, because lots of children blame their parents for sending them away on the evacuation scheme. It wasn't compulsory, and evacuee children now know that. But the government put huge pressure, especially on the mothers, to do the right thing by their children and to send them away. And I think, faced with real pressure and real threat and real fear, it must have been very hard not to say to yourself, this child is going to be safer in the countryside, away from London. And I think that's something that people completely forget. And lots of evacuee children said to me, I looked at my own children when they reached the age when I was sent away, and I thought to myself, I couldn't do that to my children. But of course, that was with the benefit of hindsight, and I think it's very easy to interpret people's actions from a 21st century perspective. I think it's very important, when we look at this subject, to remember what the social situation was of the day.
Okay, Julie, thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Best regards. Your book is